About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who used to work for me, and one of the generals called me and he said, "Sir, you got to come in. You got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, "No." He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They've just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments." And he said, "I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs," meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran."
The Bible says that there is a time for peace and a time for war. לעולם לא נשכח את מעשה הזוועה שעשו לנו אויבינו. אנחנו הולמים באויבינו בעוצמה חסרת תקדים. אני מדגיש, זאת רק ההתחלה. They've made a mistake of historic proportions. We will exact a price that will be remembered by them and Israel's other enemies for decades to come.
Israel has responded with fury. Fighter jets taking aim at targets in the Palestinian territory.
More than 10,000 people have been killed since this conflict began.
It's November 10th, 2008. Barack Obama just won an election, and he travels to the White House to meet with the outgoing president, George Bush. In that meeting, Bush told Obama about a top-secret weapon that the U.S. military had been developing with Israel since 2005, codenamed Project Olympic Games. This weapon was intended to hit one of Iran's most fortified nuclear facilities, buried deep underground, where centrifuges spin uranium to enrich it for use as energy or, with enough spinning, to be used in a nuclear weapon. But this secret weapon wasn't a missile, they weren't planning an airstrike. Instead, it was a computer file, less than a megabyte in size. 150,000 lines of pristine code. This is the weapon that the president had to tell Obama about. This little file had been planted in Iran, where it spread throughout the whole country. But it didn't do anything. It lay dormant until it found its way onto a flash drive that was then plugged in at this underground nuclear facility. And then it spread, finding its way to its final target, this one machine. And then the weapon started working, quietly reprogramming the software to very subtly sabotage these delicate spinning centrifuges, opening a valve to change the pressure, telling the centrifuge to spin a bit faster or a bit slower, all while telling the technicians that everything was working properly. Over time, these subtle manipulations destroyed these centrifuges. This was one of several weapons that the US had planted in Iran using sophisticated computer code. Now, if a war broke out with Iran, the US could turn off their power, could turn off their military defense systems, making it so they couldn't shoot down planes. They could turn off their command and control systems so they couldn't talk to each other during the fight. This was a real war plan executed by thousands of American military personnel, hundreds of millions of dollars in a cyber operation that would, quote, prepare the battlefield by weakening Iran's ability to fight. All of it using code. The code that sabotaged the nuclear facility was eventually discovered and named after some of the elements that were inside of these many lines of code. .stub or MRXnet. They called it Stuxnet. Now, this weapon did slow down Iran's progress at first, but it didn't stop them. But what this did do was showcase a new style of war. The use of quiet weapons in the form of a tiny text file that could self-replicate and wreak actual physical damage on an enemy. We call this cyber warfare, and it has become a fixture of modern conflict.
Looming all around Israel, circling like sharks sniffing for blood, are Iran and their allied proxy forces that they call the Axis of Resistance, consisting of the king, Iran itself, their Rook, the Houthis in control of northwestern Yemen, their knights, the Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria, their bishop, the Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria, their queen, Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, and their various pawns, the many Palestinian militant groups operating within the Gaza Strip, all of whom cooperate together with Iran in pursuit of a common ultimate objective: the complete annihilation of Israel as a state. Of all the pieces on the board that are in this axis of resistance, it is Iran's Rook, the Houthis, who are the ones that are the most geographically far removed from the current fight going on between Israel and Hamas. Their territory is about 1,600 kilometers away from Israel's, and separated by the entirety of Saudi Arabia and nearly the entire length of the Red Sea. The Red Sea itself can be thought of as the primary maritime passageway between Asia and Europe, and the passageway is bounded by two narrow gates on either side of it that regulate access through it: the Bab el-Mandeb Strait in the south between Yemen and Djibouti, and the Suez Canal in the north that runs across Egypt. The route between these gates across the Red Sea is a part of the shortest possible geographic route for merchant ships to take traveling between Asia and Europe, and so it's the preferred route of choice for container ships carrying manufactured goods and raw materials from places like China, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and India to take when transporting their goods to the huge European consumer market. And from another perspective, this trade route is also a major artery for the flow of global energy resources from origin to consumer, like oil and gas from places like Russia, Kazakhstan, and Azerbaijan towards Asia in one direction, and oil and gas around the Persian Gulf towards Europe in another direction. As a result, roughly 12% of the entire world's trade volume usually flows through the Red Sea on an annual basis, which includes nearly a third of the entire world's container ship traffic, roughly 10% of the world's seaborne oil, and roughly 8% of all the world's LNG. An average of 50 merchant vessels usually transit through the Suez Canal on a daily basis, and this overall makes the Suez Canal and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait the second most critical maritime choke point for globalized trade anywhere in the world, remaining only behind the Singapore Strait in Southeast Asia in overall importance.
Iranian-backed militias have attacked U.S. bases in Syria and Iraq more than 170 times since October 17th. The American deaths raise the stakes dramatically in the region.
It's quite clear that the whole players in the region are actually looking to see what will be the United States' reaction to that.
Some congressional leaders are calling on Biden to impose crippling costs on the regime, including military strikes inside Iran. Avi Melamed is a former Israeli intelligence official. He says the source address of all the conflicts in the region is Iran.
This is the mullah regime in Tehran. We have today sample of the disastrous vision and future that waits the Middle East and the world if the mullah regime is not going to be restrained forcefully.
Christians know him as the Antichrist. Sunni Muslims know him as the Muslim Christ. Shiite Muslims know him as the Mahdi.
Youssef quotes Muslim scholars on what Islam preaches about their Messiah.
Their Messiah comes. He's going to cover the whole world. He's going to rule the world. And he's going to declare himself to be a Muslim. And he's going to turn on the Christians and the Jews. And we know, of course, the Bible said the Antichrist is going to come and he's going to turn on the Christians and the Jews.
Other parallels he sees between the Mahdi and the Antichrist.
He will call himself the man of peace. That he's going to come at a time of chaos and confusion and people longing for somebody to guide them and lead them and bring them peace because they will be worn out.
Both the Bible and Islam talk about his 7-year global reign from Jerusalem and that this figure of peace will turn hyper-violent.
He's going to begin to persecute people. He's going to demand them their worship. Same thing on the other side, that he is going to kill everybody who does not worship him.
A lot of the scholars agree that the first of the major signs will be the Mahdi. Who is Al-Mahdi? Al-Mahdi means, in English, the awaited one and the anointed one. So the chosen, awaited one.
As the earth was filled with wrong and oppression, he will fill it with justice and peace.
The Mahdi. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he says, that the day of judgment will not take place until Allah sends a man from my descent, from my progeny. His name is my name. His father's name is my father's name. Even the Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam describes him. In Nabi alayhi salatu wa sallam, he says, Ajlan jabha. He has a broad, clear forehead. Here, not much hair at the front. Very broad and clear forehead. Aqna al-anf. Prominent nose. Like high up a bit. Tiny and high up a bit. Describes him Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Then in Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam he says, he will spread this world justice and peace after it was filled up with injustice and oppression. Then he says, and he'll stay here for 7 years. Another hadith, 8 years. Another hadith, 9 years. So his rulership, his leadership will last between 7 to 9 years.
He will appear when the world is in chaos and he will bring peace. So Ahmadinejad, the former president of Iran, basically wanted to stir up trouble and get the nuclear weapon so they can attack Israel and create an atmosphere of chaos so that to force their Mahdi or the 12th Caliphate to show up.
And some of the most violent Sunnis are also trying to set off the end times.
Particularly those whom the Middle East people call Daesh or ISIS or IS. They also have that concept that when chaos and bloodshed reign supreme, and that's why they're shedding so much blood, that their Messiah will come.
Could you help us just, big picture, by way of comparison, Islamic eschatology? I know there's some variation there, but as a generality, Islamic eschatology and how you see that lining up with Christian eschatology.
Sure. Well, to keep it simple, I always say this, that when you look at their story, it's an anti-parallel. It's like a mirror image of the biblical narrative. The problem is their good guys are framed as our bad guys, and our good guys become, within their narrative, the bad guys. So within Islamic eschatology, you have two primary good guys, and you have one bad guy. The good guys are their primary Messiah figure, known as the Mahdi. You could just say in English, the Mahdi. He's their primary Messiah figure that they're looking for. That's both Sunni and Shia. And then they also believe the second good guy that's going to come back is Jesus. They call him Isa the Messiah. And he's going to come back as an assistant to the Mahdi. And he's essentially going to tell all the Christians of the world that your religion is corrupt, your Bible's corrupt. Islam is the true religion. You've all been deceived, that when he was here, he never claimed to be God. He never died on a cross. That's all historical fiction. And that Christians need to embrace Islam. That's the true religion. And they need to follow the Mahdi.
You compare what he does to the false prophet in the book of Revelation, chapter 13, 16, 19, 20 refer to the beasts coming out of the earth, the false prophet, who aids and abets the Antichrist. He is, as the Mahdi is the exact replica of the Antichrist, the Jesus prophet in Islam is the exact parallel to the false prophet who aids and abets the Antichrist. One of their writings says he espouses the cause of the Mahdi. He is the Mahdi's executioner. He is the Mahdi's enforcer. He is the Mahdi's prophet. And it is he who kills the Antichrist. That leads me to the third person. The Antichrist will show up. The Muslims call him Dajjal. He is the great deceiver. He comes to earth on a mule, and he's blind in one eye. He is an infidel. He is a false miracle worker, this Antichrist, this Islamic Antichrist. But you know who he claims to be? He claims to be Jesus, the Son of God. He claims to be deity. He will attempt to stop the Mahdi and the true Jesus, but the true Jesus will slaughter him. This is their view of the true Christ. Our Jesus is their Antichrist. Our Antichrist is their Redeemer. It is a satanic counterfeit that is in complete reverse. The army, this is a quote, the army of Satan will be led by a person who will claim to be Jesus Christ. There will be a great battle. The Muslim Jesus will fight the false Jesus and kill him and establish Islam forever. The truth is, the true Jesus will destroy the Antichrist and the false prophet and establish his kingdom forever. This is Satan's complete counterfeit. Muslim world domination.
Am I understanding this correctly, that somehow that the Jewish people are going to rebuild the temple, and so a third temple, and then from there that an Islamic group is going to kind of take over and desecrate that space?
Could a Texas cow start Armageddon in the Middle East in April 2024? And what does this have to do with Israel's war on Palestine's Gaza? On the 100-day anniversary of Israel's brutal assault on Gaza, Hamas spokesman Abu Ubaidah released a video explaining the motivations behind the group's incursion into Israel on October 7th. Alongside Israel's continued occupation of Palestine, he also mentioned the bringing of red cows into the occupied Palestinian territories. Ubaidah was referring to the plans of numerous right-wing Israeli groups who believe that a red cow must be sacrificed in order for the Jews to progress plans to demolish the Al-Aqsa Mosque and build the fabled Third Temple in its place. It might sound like a conspiracy theory, but hardliner Israeli group the Temple Institute have already purchased and imported 5 red Angus heifers from Texas at a cost of $500,000. They have been grazing in a kibbutz in the occupied West Bank since 2022, with reports that the sacrifice is planned to take place as early as April 2024. The sacrifice of the red heifer has its roots in the Torah and the Talmud, and it is believed that the ritual is necessary to purify the Jews so that they can pray at the Al-Aqsa compound.
Jesus' sermon, all of it, Sermon on the End Times, and then, the book of Revelation, any treatment of that topic is rooted and grounded in Daniel's explanation concerning the abomination of desolation. This is the definitive event, defining, marker in the last days. And you cannot have a temple, you can't have something desolated. You can't have something abominated unless it exists previously, right? Mm-hmm. You can't have offerings cease, which is what Daniel says, which is what Jesus says, which is what Revelation says, unless something begins first. So there will clearly be sacrifices that will be taking place, and then the Antichrist will invade in an adversarial manner. It says forces from him will arise and desecrate the sanctuary fortress. So he invades, he puts an end to those offerings, he sets himself up there in the temple. That is the middle of the final week, the final Shabuah, that Daniel defines, that Jesus reiterates, and that the book of Revelation reiterates. So whether or not there will be a brick and mortar structure or not, it could be something as simple as a tent. There will be an altar erected, there will be sacrifices, there will be something, the Bible refers to it as the temple of God, and then the Antichrist will invade and put a stop to those things.
The sacrifice will reportedly take place on a plot of land on the Mount of Olives, facing the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The cow must be completely red, including its hooves, and must be around 3 years old at the time of sacrifice. Following the sacrifice, the ashes of the cow are due to be mixed with water and used to purify selected Jewish priests and their adherents. Since occupying East Jerusalem in 1967, right-wing Zionists have long sought to build a third temple in place of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. While initially the goal only of fringe groups such as the Temple Institute, the plan has been mainstreamed in recent years, with groups of settlers regularly storming the Muslim compound and attracting support from numerous politicians and commentators. Temple organizations have even submitted blueprints for the construction of the temple and prepared the ornaments it will hold. Last year, during the month of Ramadan, a temple movement activist activist was arrested after he and a group of Jewish extremists attempted to bring a goat into the Al-Aqsa compound for a ritual sacrifice.
Do you think it's possible that the temple is the church, given the New Testament imagery for that?
No, because the New Testament references to the church, being the temple, they don't overrule the clear language that Daniel uses and that Jesus uses.
Mm-hmm.
He definitely expands upon this concept and says, hey, in a spiritual sense, we are the temple of God. But in no way does that, as I said, overrule these very clear texts that, it's referenced 4 times in the book of Daniel. It's referenced in Daniel 8, like verses 9 through 12. It's in Daniel 9, 26 and 27. It's in Daniel 11, 31, Daniel 12, 11. It reiterates this many times. And it uses the language of a temple.
In the book of Numbers, chapter 19, it is stated that,
"And the Lord spoke to Moses and to Aaron, saying, This is the ordinance of the law which the Lord has commanded, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, that they bring you a red heifer without spot, wherein is no blemish, and upon which never came yoke. And you shall give her to Eleazar the priest, that he may bring her forth without the camp, and one shall slay her before his face. And Eleazar the priest shall take of her blood with his finger, and sprinkle of her blood directly before the tabernacle of the congregation 7 times. And one shall burn the heifer in his sight, her skin, and her flesh, and her blood, with her dung, shall he burn. And the priest shall take cedar wood, and hyssop, and scarlet, and cast it into the midst of the burning of the heifer."
The red heifer is a female bovine which has never been pregnant or milked or yoked, also known as the red cow. It was brought to the priests as a sacrifice according to the Torah, and its ashes were used for ritual purification. According to their rabbis, since the time of Moses, only 9 red heifers have been sacrificed. The last time one was sacrificed was just before the Second Temple was destroyed by the Romans, on the Mount of Olives opposite to the Temple Mount. According to their rabbis, when the 10th cow is to be sacrificed, they will enter into the age of Dajjal. But to them, he will be their awaited Messiah. The Temple Institute is preparing for this event to take place soon. After the sacrifice takes place, you will see an unprovoked attack against Al-Aqsa like never before. Their intentions are utter destruction, to the point in which they can commence building the Temple of Dajjal on top of the ruins of Al-Aqsa. They believe once the 3rd temple is completed, it will speed up the coming of their Messiah, known to Muslims as the Dajjal, who will deceive the entire world, except those who have true faith in their Creator.
When you have a picture in Ezekiel 38, you have a picture of the Antichrist, Gog, and you have the listing of 8 nations that will be a coalition for the Antichrist. All 8 of those are Muslim nations. All 8 of them. And they ring the Mediterranean, all the way to Libya.
So I actually believe that the fall of the Ottoman Empire in 1923, 1924 is sort of the fulfillment of this fatal head wound of the beast. A lot of Christians think this is primarily speaking of the Antichrist. He's going to die and come back, and it'll be a false resurrection, this type of thing. We need to remember that the motif, the symbol of beast, begins in Daniel, and it's referring to empires. And so this 7th empire will suffer a fatal head wound, and it will come back. It will be revived. Now, will the Antichrist go through this type of scenario as well? Quite possibly. But again, the Old Testament backdrop says the first way that we should be looking at this is the empire. So that was roughly coming up on 100 years ago. And so in my book, again, written 16 years ago, I predict that we would see, based on the prophecy of Ezekiel 38 and 39, the revival of the Ottoman Empire. The scriptures say the fatal head wound would be healed. And this coalition, this alliance, this empire would be revived, and all the peoples of the world would be terrified. Who can make war with this multinational coalition? When you combine the militaries of Turkey, of Iran, with a measure of Russian and Chinese backing, with Pakistan with nuclear weapons, and on and on and on, you have a formidable army that's far greater than all of the armies of Europe combined.
If Israel were to attempt to demolish the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the 3rd holiest site in Islam, it would trigger outrage across the Arab and Muslim world. However, even if these right-wing Jewish groups are unable to proceed with the demolition, many fear that the sacrifice itself could embolden Jewish extremists to occupy the mosque and further restrict the rights of Palestinians to access the holy site.
And just to interrupt real quick, didn't he say something about the Al-Aqsa Mosque? I can't pronounce it. You know it better than me. But the mosque that's on the Temple Mount, like taking it back, didn't he say something about that in this context?
Absolutely, yeah. Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem is the lead-domed mosque that's up there, not the gold-domed, for what it's worth. And that the inference is he's projecting that he is the leader that's going to, because again, this is prophesied in Islamic prophecy that the last days caliph is going to establish Islamic rule on the Temple Mount. And they view Israel's limited control of the Temple Mount as an occupying force. And so he is, what's the term they use in politics? He's whistling, to the Islamists, so to speak, and he's presenting himself. And many are looking to him as sort of this, this revived caliph, the leader of the Islamic world. So this is, again, politicians, American, the State Department, they need to be aware of what this means, because he's a member of NATO. I mean, we have nukes there in the Incirlik Air Force Base there in eastern Turkey. I mean, it's about 5 to 10 years past time, unfortunately, that we kick Turkey out of NATO and recognize what has taken place. It's the new Iran, let's just put it that way.
Who does not know about the craze for the strongest and the most advanced weaponry among the superpowers, especially America, Russia, Israel, and China? America, for the last 10 years or so, has been spending huge sums on developing drone attack technology. It has also been exporting them to other countries for hefty amounts. In 2020, America conducted its first ever experiment in which they tested artificial intelligence controlling drone attacks. The results were astounding. The drones controlled by the robots were 20 times more apt and accurate. At the same time, China had been involved in creating the deadliest weapons in the world with the help of the best developers from the world. Some of the Chinese drones are the smallest in size and the most sensitive, so much that they would not even leave a bird flying above the battlefield. Despite being so deadly, they are hardly detectable by the enemy. And then there is Israel. Israel has been preparing drones with the most advanced communication systems, sharp surveillance, and almost complete autonomous control. All these countries have also been exporting these drones to other countries and earning millions of dollars. These three names had been the list of the superpowers of the world, and they were fighting with each other for the title. But there was another country working for years to enter the weapons race stronger than ever. Yes, you guessed it right. It was Turkey. The drones developed by Turkey are lighter in weight than those of America, and they can carry all kinds of weights as well. In the opening days of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the Turkish-made Bayraktar TB2 drone emerged as one of the war's unlikely heroes. This came out as the factor Russia had never expected or even thought of. Newspapers and media were filled with the headlines that Turkey's drones are a major threat to Russia and its allies. The drones played such a strategic role that they took over the battlefield in no time. The drones directed the Ukrainian military to be placed in such a way and prepare the ground in such a way that the heavy-duty cannons of Russia, which were approaching in large numbers, would get stuck in the ground and would not be able to move any further. And the same happened. Turkey has become a huge threat to the military industry of America, Israel, and China, countries which earn millions and billions of dollars by exporting their drones and fighter jets.
Who's winning the new scramble for Africa? Well, China is in pole position, but this race has a dark horse, a country you wouldn't expect to do well. And that's Turkey. Let's look at some numbers first. Turkish firms have completed more than 1,800 projects in Africa, 1,800. Total cost, around $85 billion. They also employ a lot of people. Reports say around 100,000 Africans. Trade is also booming. In 2003, bilateral trade was just $5.4 billion. In 2022, it reached $41 billion, and chances are it hit $50 billion last year. This growth is not random. It's part of Turkey's long-term strategy. They have actively focused in Africa. Again, let's look at more numbers. In 2002, Turkey had just 12 embassies in Africa. 2 decades later, they have 44. So what's the game plan here? What does Ankara want from Africa? What everyone wants: political support and business. In the last century, Turkey was not as interested in Africa. Their focus was on the West, on joining the European community. But in 1997, they got a reality check. Ankara was denied full membership of the European Union, so time was ticking. Turkey needed to diversify its foreign policy. In 1998, a new plan was unveiled: the Action Plan for Africa. It was later taken forward by Recep Tayyip Erdogan, first as Prime Minister, then as President of his country. He's taken personal interest in this relationship with Africa. Guess how many times he's visited Africa? 40 times in 20 years, more than any other world leader. In 2005, Turkey declared the Year of Africa. Think of it as a grand PR exercise. That year, Erdogan visited Ethiopia and South Africa. He announced multiple projects. Others were late to the party. China declared the Year of Africa 1 year later. France did so 5 years later. So Turkey really set the trend. And what did they get in return? Political support. Turkey got observer status at the African Union. It was also declared a strategic partner in 2008, but the big victory came at the United Nations. Turkey was eyeing a temporary seat at the Security Council, and in 2010, they got it. How? Because African nations supported them. It's been a hybrid strategy. You can see Turkish cultural centers, hospitals and schools in Africa. You can also see Turkish military bases in Libya and Somalia. Erdogan has struck security agreements with 30 African nations. Each agreement is different. Some allow Turkey to train African soldiers, others permit Turkish deployments. Either way, it's a win for Ankara. And looks like that will be Erdogan's pitch. That of a defense equipment provider. Of course, drones are on top of this list. Turkey has sold its Bayraktar TB2 drones to 10 African nations, like Niger, Burkina Faso and Mali. All three are battling terror groups. Turkish drones could give them an edge. Some African countries have already used the TB2, like Ethiopia and Togo. So going forward, drone diplomacy could be Erdogan's focus. Also, Islamic diplomacy. Some 27% of Africa's population is Muslim, and Erdogan loves to flaunt his religious credentials. The biggest example of that is Ghana. A massive blue mosque was inaugurated back in 2021. It was fully funded by Turkey. So it's clear why Erdogan wants Africa, a big market for his drones, support at the United Nations, also fertile ground to further his Islamist agenda. But what's in it for Africa? Well, too many options is never a bad thing. Plus, Ankara comes with less baggage. Turkey was not a colonial power in most of Africa. It also doesn't care about democracy. The US or Europe may not sell weapons to a military regime, but Erdogan will do so happily. No criticism, no judgments. What's impressive, though, is his secrecy. Everyone knows what China is doing in Africa. They also know about Russian and American designs, but Turkey has sort of slipped under the radar. Maybe that's how Erdogan wants it. After all, you cannot combat what you don't know.